The first transmission crackled through the radio at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade through silk. Mayday, Mayday. This is civilian aircraft November 74 Whiskey Delta, requesting immediate assistance. I am being pursued by unidentified military aircraft over restricted airspace. The voice belonged to Marcus Thorne, a 34-year-old insurance adjuster from Portland, who had never fired a gun in anger or worn a uniform. Yet somehow, inexplicably, he was flying a vintage F-4 Phantom II at 28,000 feet above the Nevada desert, with 3 state-of-the-art F-35 Lightning IIs closing fast on his 6 o'clock position. At Nellis Air Force Base, the duty officer stared at his radar screen in disbelief. The aircraft's transponder code was broadcasting something that shouldn't exist, a classified squadron designation that had been retired and sealed 23 years ago. Ghost 77 Actual, the Valkyrie Squadron. Major Cassandra Reaper Volkov sat in the ready room, coffee growing cold in her hands as the scramble alarm pierced the morning air. At 31, she had logged over 2,000 flight hours in everything from F-16s to F-22s, but the other pilots still whispered behind her back. Too emotional, they said. Too invested. The kind of pilot who remembers every face she's ever seen through a targeting pod. They didn't know about her father. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Volkov had been the commanding officer of the Valkyrie Squadron during Operation Fallen Angel in 2001, a classified mission that officially never happened. 16 pilots had taken off from this very base 23 years ago. Only 3 had returned, and none of them had ever spoken about what they'd encountered in the mountains of Afghanistan. Marcus Thorne's hands trembled as he gripped the stick of the Phantom fighter, the aircraft responding with an elegance that defied explanation. He shouldn't know how to fly this machine, shouldn't understand the arcane symbology dancing across the heads-up display, shouldn't be able to read the tactical situation developing around him with crystalline clarity. But somehow, impossibly, he did. The radio crackled again. Unknown aircraft, this is Viper Lead. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Reduce throttle and follow my lead to the nearest military airfield, or we will be forced to engage. Marcus glanced at the photograph tucked into the corner of the instrument panel, a picture of his 7-year-old daughter Emma, her gap-toothed smile frozen in time. Beside it, inexplicably, was a faded squadron patch bearing the image of a winged woman carrying a sword. The Valkyrie Squadron, patch his father had never spoken about. Major Volkov strapped herself into her F-22 Raptor, the sleek predator that had become an extension of her well over 8 years of combat operations. As she ran through her pre-flight checklist, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the desert morning air. The civilian had used her father's squadron designation, Ghost 77 Actual, the call sign that had died with Viktor Volkov over the Hindu Kush Mountains when Cassandra was 8 years old, clutching a similar squadron patch and waiting for a father who would never come home. The tower controller's voice cut through her reverie. Reaper, you're cleared for immediate takeoff. Intercept and identify the unknown aircraft. Rules of engagement are weapons-free if the target proves hostile. Cassandra pushed the throttles forward, feeling 37,000 pounds of thrust slam her back into the ejection seat. The Raptor leaped into the pale morning sky like a falcon diving for prey, her radar immediately painting the impossible target ahead. The F-4 Phantom was flying patterns that no civilian should know, executing combat maneuvers with a precision that spoke of decades of experience. Yet according to every database in the military's vast electronic memory, Marcus Thorne had never served a day in his life. 50 miles away, Marcus felt the F-22s climbing toward him like death itself, their stealth signatures barely visible on his aging radar. The Phantom systems were 40 years old, museum pieces compared to the technological marvels hunting him, yet something whispered in his mind that he could outfly them all. He pulled back on the stick and felt the Phantom climb into a chandelle turn that would have impressed even the pilots who had originally flown these machines in Vietnam. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat, but his body seemed to remember training he'd never received, conditioning he'd never endured. In the F-22's cockpit, Cassandra watched the unknown pilot execute a maneuver that belonged in an aerial combat manual, not in the repertoire of a civilian insurance adjuster. Her father had described that exact same turn in the letters he'd written during his deployment, letters she'd found hidden in her mother's attic years after the funeral. This is Reaper to Control. The unknown aircraft is definitely military trained. Pilot demonstrates advanced tactical knowledge. Marcus keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the impossibility of his situation. Reaper, this is Ghost 77 Actual. I need to speak with someone who remembers Operation Fallen Angel. The words hit Cassandra like a physical blow. Operation Fallen Angel was classified beyond top secret, buried so deep that even she had only learned fragments through years of careful investigation. The official records claimed her father's squadron had been lost during a routine training exercise. But Marcus Thorne, an insurance adjuster from Portland, knew the real name of the mission that had killed her father. The F-4 suddenly broke left in a maneuver that belonged to a different era of air combat, a time when pilots fought with guns and missiles instead of beyond visual range weapons and stealth technology. Yet there was something hauntingly familiar about the way the Phantom moved through the sky, a signature that tugged at memories Cassandra thought she'd buried. Her father had flown exactly the same way. The radio crackled with encrypted chatter as more fighters launched from Nellies, the morning sky beginning to fill with the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, all hunting one impossible man in an antique fighter who shouldn't exist. Marcus checked his fuel gauge and felt a spike of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the tactical situation. The Phantom was nearly empty, which should have been impossible given that the aircraft had been sitting in a museum in Oregon 24 hours ago. At least that's what he remembered. The last clear memory he possessed was tucking Emma into bed Tuesday night, reading her a story about brave pilots who flew into storms to save people in trouble. He'd kissed her forehead and promised to take her to the Air Museum on Saturday. Now it was Thursday morning, and he was flying a combat mission that felt as familiar as breathing. The F-22s were closing fast, their weapons systems painting him with targeting lasers that set off every warning system in the Phantom's dated electronic warfare suite. Marcus knew he had perhaps 90 seconds before they achieved weapons lock, 90 seconds to solve a mystery that had apparently been waiting 23 years for him to arrive. He keyed the radio again, this time using a frequency that existed nowhere in current military communications protocols. Angel Base, this is Ghost 77 Actual. Request immediate authentication code Valkyrie Delta 7. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the encrypted chatter between the pursuing fighters stopped, as if the entire Nevada desert was holding its breath. Then, impossibly, a voice answered from a radio station that had been decommissioned in 2001. Ghost 77 Actual, this is Angel Base. Authentication confirmed. Welcome home, Victor. Cassandra's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The voice on the radio belonged to her father's wing commander, Colonel James Morrison, who had been dead for 18 years. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as memories that weren't his own flooded through his mind like a dam bursting. The last mission of the Valkyrie Squadron, the impossible enemy they'd encountered in the mountains of Afghanistan, the sacrifice that had saved thousands of lives but could never be acknowledged. The sacrifice that had cost Viktor Volkov his life and left his 8-year-old daughter to grow up believing her father had died in a training accident. He understood now why he was here, why the Phantom had called to him across decades of silence. The Valkyrie Squadron had one last mission to complete, and somehow Marcus Thorne, insurance adjuster, single father, ordinary man, had been chosen to finish what Viktor Volkov had started. The F-22s were within missile range now, their pilots waiting for the order to fire. But Cassandra Volkov sat frozen in her cockpit, watching an impossible ghost fly patterns her dead father had taught her in dreams she'd thought were memories. Major Cassandra Volkov had earned her call sign Reaper during a tour in Syria, where she developed an uncanny ability to appear at exactly the right moment to tip the balance of an engagement. Her squadron mates joked that she could smell enemy aircraft across 50 miles of desert, but Cassandra knew the truth was darker than intuition. She dreamed about the pilots she killed, every face, every final transmission, every family that would receive a folded flag instead of a homecoming. The other pilots called it weakness, but Cassandra knew it was the price of never missing her target. Now, for the first time in 8 years of combat operations, she hesitated with her finger on the trigger. The F-4 Phantom ahead of her was flying like Viktor Volkov had returned from the dead, executing maneuvers she'd only seen in grainy gun camera footage from her father's final mission. The mission that officially never happened, the mission that had haunted her dreams since childhood. Reaper, this is Control. You are cleared to engage. Repeat, you are weapons free. Marcus heard the transmission bleeding through the tactical frequency and knew his time was running out. The Phantom was an ancient warrior compared to the technological marvels pursuing him, but it possessed something the modern fighters lacked: the accumulated experience of every pilot who had ever flown her into combat. He could feel them all in the cockpit with him now. Young men barely out of flight school who had died over North Vietnam, seasoned veterans who had carved their names into history above the Iraqi desert, and most clearly of all, Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Volkov during his final moments over Afghanistan. The memories weren't his own, but they belonged to him now. Viktor's last thoughts as his damaged fighter screamed toward the mountainside had been of his daughter, of the 8-year-old girl who would grow up without her father because he'd chosen duty over survival. He'd chosen to complete the mission rather than eject to safety. Cassandra, Marcus whispered into his radio, using a frequency that existed only in the Phantom's modified communications array. Your father wants you to know he's proud of you. The F-22 dropped back slightly as if the pilot had been physically struck. Cassandra's hands shook on the controls as she stared at the impossible aircraft ahead of her. Her father's fighter returned from the grave with a stranger's voice speaking words only Viktor Volkov should know. Who are you? She transmitted on the same impossible frequency. Marcus pulled the Phantom into a gentle bank that offered Cassandra a clear view of the aircraft's fuselage. There, painted beneath the cockpit in faded letters that shouldn't exist, was her father's name and the mission tally that represented 6 years of distinguished service. But it was the smaller marking below Victor's name that made Cassandra's vision blur with tears. A child's drawing of a stick figure pilot, carefully reproduced in regulation paint, the picture she'd given her father the day before his final deployment. He'd carried her drawing into combat for 6 months before the mission that would claim his life. My name is Marcus Thorne, the impossible voice replied. But right now, I'm carrying your father's memories, his skills, and his last mission. There's something in the Nevada mountains that needs to be finished, something that's been waiting 23 years for the right pilot to complete it. The other F-22s were spreading into attack formation, their pilots growing impatient with the delay. Cassandra knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before someone else made the decision to fire, 30 seconds to choose between following orders and following her heart. What's the mission? She asked. Marcus felt Victor's memories crystallize with startling clarity. The Valkyrie Squadron's final operation hadn't been a routine training flight that went wrong. It had been an emergency response to something that had appeared over a classified facility in the Nevada mountains, something that had required 16 of the military's best pilots and had nearly broken through Earth's defenses. They'd stopped it barely, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. 13 pilots had died buying time for the facility to activate its final countermeasures. The 3 survivors had been sworn to secrecy and then systematically transferred to different commands to ensure their silence. Viktor Volkov had been one of those survivors, and the mission had haunted him until a training accident 2 years later, an accident that hadn't been quite as accidental as the official reports suggested. "There's a facility buried in the mountains northeast of here," Marcus replied. "Something broke containment last night. The same kind of something your father died fighting 23 years ago." Cassandra felt the world shift around her as pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life suddenly clicked into place. Her father's nightmares, her mother's careful silence about his final years, the classified files that had been redacted beyond recognition whenever she'd tried to research Operation Fallen Angel. Viktor Volkov hadn't died in a training accident. He'd been murdered to keep him quiet about something the government couldn't afford to acknowledge. "Control, this is Reaper," she transmitted on the standard tactical frequency. "The unknown aircraft is not hostile. Repeat, the target is friendly. I'm escorting him to a secure landing area for debriefing." The response was immediate and furious. "Negative, Reaper. You will engage the target immediately or return to base. That is a direct order." Cassandra looked ahead at the Phantom, at her father's impossible return from the grave, and made the same choice Viktor Volkov had made 23 years ago. She chose the mission over orders, chose truth over silence, chose her family over her career. "Control, this is Reaper going dark. If you want to stop us, you'll have to shoot down 2 of your own pilots." She switched off her transponder and dropped her F-22 into formation beside the Phantom, 2 fighters from different eras flying together toward a mountain range that held secrets worth killing for. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that belonged to Viktor Volkov as he watched his daughter choose the same path he'd walked decades ago. The Valkyrie Squadron had always been about more than following orders. It had been about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, even when the threat came from humanity's darkest nightmares. "Thank you," he transmitted to Cassandra. "Your father is proud of you. He always has been." The Phantom and the Raptor climbed toward the mountains together, pursued by the most advanced fighters in the world, and guided by the ghost of a squadron that had died to keep humanity safe from something it wasn't ready to understand. Behind them, the Nevada desert began to shake as something ancient and hungry stirred beneath the earth, waiting for the sun to set and the real hunt to begin. Marcus felt the Phantom's engines respond to his touch like a living thing, the ancient fighter eager for one last mission after decades of museum silence. The aircraft's systems hummed with an energy that had nothing to do with jet fuel and electricity, something deeper, something that connected every pilot who had ever trusted their life to wings and engines and prayer. Cassandra matched his climb with the effortless grace of a pilot who had been born for the sky, her F-22 sliding through the air like quicksilver given form. Even through the impossible situation, Marcus could see why she'd earned her reputation as one of the Air Force's deadliest pilots. She flew with Victor's precision, but none of his haunted caution. Where her father had learned to fear the sky's darker mysteries, Cassandra had never encountered anything that made her doubt the supremacy of human technology and training. That was about to change. Unknown contacts, bearing 035 Angels 28. Cassandra's voice was steady as she reported the radar contacts climbing from the mountain valleys ahead. "I count 6. No, 8 bogies. Configuration unknown." Marcus felt Victor's memories recoil from what the radar was showing them. The contacts weren't displaying the characteristic signatures of any known aircraft, No heat bloom from engines. No electromagnetic emissions from radar or communication systems. No transponder codes to identify nationality or intent. They were moving at impossible speeds and executing maneuvers that would have crushed any human pilot under G-forces that exceeded the limits of biology and engineering. Cassandra, whatever you see up there, remember that your weapons won't stop them. We're not here to fight, we're here to contain. The F-22's sophisticated sensors began tracking the incoming contacts, and Cassandra felt her training warring with evidence her mind refused to accept. The bogies were accelerating from subsonic to hypersonic in seconds, changing direction without regard for momentum or physics, clustering and separating in patterns that suggested intelligence, but followed no tactical doctrine she'd ever studied. Control, this is Reaper. I have multiple unknown contacts displaying impossible flight characteristics. Request immediate backup in. The radio exploded in static as something electromagnetic swept through the area, jamming every frequency and leaving both pilots isolated in a bubble of silence. Marcus felt the Phantom's aged systems flicker and stabilize, the old analog components somehow more resistant to whatever was interfering with their electronics. "Stay close," he transmitted on the Phantom's internal frequency, hopping Cassandra could still receive. "They don't like modern electronics, the older the better." Ahead of them, the Nevada mountains rose like ancient teeth against the morning sky, their peaks shrouded in clouds that moved against the prevailing wind. Somewhere in those peaks was a facility that had been built to contain something humanity wasn't meant to encounter, a prison that had held its charge for 7 decades until last night's containment failure. Marcus could see the facility now through Victor's memories, a sprawling complex buried beneath a mountain, connected to the surface by a single heavily fortified elevator shaft. The place where America's darkest secrets went to disappear, where artifacts and entities from crashed vehicles and failed experiments waited in climate-controlled storage for the day when humanity might be ready to understand them. That day had never come. Instead, the facility had become a tomb, its guardians sworn to silence and its prisoners left to rage in their electromagnetic cages until time or accident set them free. The first attack came without warning. Something that existed primarily as electromagnetic interference rather than solid matter swept through the Phantom's cockpit, and for a terrifying moment Marcus felt his consciousness overlap with an alien intelligence that regarded humanity the way an entomologist might view a particularly troublesome species of insect. The Phantom shuddered and rolled to the right as its flight controls were temporarily overridden by something that understood the machine's responses better than its own designers. Marcus fought for control, while Victor's memory screamed warnings about entities that could inhabit technology, turn humanity's tools against them, convert their weapons into instruments of their own destruction. Cassandra's F-22 suddenly accelerated past him in an attack run that no human pilot had authorized, her aircraft's weapon systems cycling through target acquisition without her input. Marcus watched in horror as the most advanced fighter in the world's arsenal prepared to fire on ground targets that included a nearby town, where 10,000 innocent people were starting their morning routines. "Cassandra, eject. The aircraft is compromised." But even as he transmitted the warning, Marcus knew she wouldn't abandon her fighter. She was Viktor Volkov's daughter, and the Valkyrie Squadron had never retreated from a fight, never abandoned their post, never chosen personal safety over the mission that needed to be completed. The F-22's missile bay opened, and Marcus could see the reflection of the early morning sun on the warheads of 6 air-to-ground missiles capable of leveling city blocks. Cassandra was fighting her own aircraft systems, trying to override targeting solutions that seemed to emerge from the fighter's computers without her input. Marcus pushed the Phantom's throttles to military power and rolled inverted, diving toward the possessed Raptor with the desperation of a man watching his own daughter fall toward destruction. The Phantom was older, slower, less sophisticated than the F-22, but it possessed one advantage that modern fighters had traded away for technological supremacy. It was simple enough for a human to understand completely. He opened fire with the Phantom's 20 cannon, sending a stream of depleted uranium shells into the space just ahead of the F-22's nose, not trying to destroy Cassandra's aircraft, but hoping to disrupt whatever electromagnetic entity was trying to control it. The shells passed through empty air and struck something that shouldn't have been there, a translucent field of energy that surrounded the Raptor like a cocoon of living lightning. The entity recoiled from the impact, its control wavering just enough for Cassandra to regain partial command of her aircraft. She pulled the F-22 out of its attack dive, climbing toward the mountains as her fighter's systems flickered between human and alien control. Behind them, more contacts were rising from the valleys like luminous wasps disturbed from their nest, moving with purpose and intelligence toward targets that included major population centers across the western United States. The facility, Marcus transmitted, hopping Cassandra could still hear him through the electromagnetic interference. "We need to reach the facility. There's a kill switch, something that can force them back into containment." But reaching the facility meant flying through a gauntlet of entities that had been trapped for 70 years and were eager to take their revenge on the species that had imprisoned them. Marcus felt Victor's memories of the last mission, the desperate fighting retreat that had cost 13 pilots their lives just to buy enough time for 3 survivors to activate the containment protocol. This time, there were only 2 pilots, and the entities had learned from their previous encounter with human military technology. Cassandra fought her way clear of the electromagnetic entity's control, just as something else slammed into her fighter from below. Something solid this time, something that left scratches in the F-22's supposedly impenetrable stealth coating. Her radar painted a contact that looked like a cross between a fighter aircraft and a living creature, all flowing curves and impossible angles that hurt to look at directly. She rolled left and found herself looking at something that her training insisted couldn't exist, an aircraft that seemed to be grown rather than built, its surface rippling with patterns that suggested both advanced technology and biological evolution. It paced her turn with effortless grace, studying her with what might have been curiosity or hunger. Then it attacked with weapons that fired coherent beams of energy instead of missiles or bullets, carving through the air where her F-22 had been with surgical precision. Cassandra found herself in a dogfight against an opponent that seemed to anticipate her every move, counter her every tactic, learn from every maneuver she attempted. Marcus brought the Phantom around in a slashing attack that would have made Viktor Volkov proud, his cannon shells striking the biomechanical aircraft's flank and causing it to recoil with what sounded disturbingly like a shriek of pain. The entity turned its attention to him, and suddenly Marcus was flying for his life against something that moved through the sky like a predator that had evolved specifically to hunt other aircraft. It was beautiful and terrifying, a work of art that happened to be trying to kill him with weapons that fired coherent energy and left trails of ionized air in their wake. The Phantom's aging radar warning system screamed constant alerts as targeting beams swept over the aircraft, painting him for weapons that existed outside human understanding. But Marcus had Victor's memories, and Victor had fought these things before. The trick wasn't to outfly them. They were faster, more maneuverable, and completely unbound by the physical laws that constrained human technology. The trick was to remember that they were still fundamentally alien, still thinking in patterns that had evolved in a different environment under different pressures. They expected their prey to run or hide or try to match their technological superiority. They didn't expect an ancient fighter to turn directly toward them in a head-on attack that violated every principle of modern air combat. Marcus held the Phantom steady as the biomechanical aircraft fired its energy weapons, feeling the superheated air from near misses buffet his aircraft as he closed to gun range. At the last possible second, he rolled inverted and fired a burst that caught the entity's ventral surface, watching with grim satisfaction as it tumbled away trailing something that might have been luminous blood. Cassandra had used the distraction to break free from her own attacker, her F-22 climbing toward the mountain facility with single-minded determination. She could see the complex now, a cluster of innocuous-looking buildings that concealed the most classified installation in the United States government. But between them and their destination, more entities were rising from hidden valleys and concealed caves, answering some unheard call to converge on the two human aircraft that dared to challenge their freedom. The sky filled with impossible shapes, aircraft that looked like crystalline sculptures, fighters that seemed to be made of living metal, interceptors that flickered in and out of visible spectrum like deadly mirages. All of them converging on Marcus and Cassandra with the focused intent of predators that had waited 7 decades for revenge. Marcus felt Victor's memories crystallize into a plan that had been forming in the back of his mind since the moment he'd found himself in the Phantom's cockpit. The Valkyrie Squadron's final mission hadn't ended with Victor's death. It had only been postponed, waiting for the right moment and the right pilots to complete it. He keyed the Phantom's radio one last time, broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. "This is Ghost 77 Actual to all surviving Valkyrie personnel. Operation Fallen Angel is hereby reactivated. All units converge on Angel Base for final mission completion." The response came from aircraft that had been dead for 23 years, voices speaking through radios that existed only in the quantum foam between dimensions. Gradually, impossibly, the Phantom's radar began painting friendly contacts, the ghosts of the Valkyrie Squadron rising to fly one last mission with their living comrades. Cassandra watched in stunned amazement as transparent fighters materialized around them, ancient F-4 Phantoms flown by pilots who had died to protect a secret they'd never been allowed to share. They formed up in combat formation, 13 ghost fighters escorting 2 living pilots toward a facility that held the key to humanity's survival. The entities seemed to recognize something in the Spectral Squadron's approach, their attacks becoming more desperate and uncoordinated as they realized that the humans had brought reinforcements from beyond the grave itself. Viktor Volkov's Phantom took point position, leading his daughter and his squadron toward the mountain facility, where a single switch waited to send the entities back to the dimensional prison they'd escaped from, if Marcus and Cassandra could survive long enough to reach it. The final battle for Earth's skis was about to begin, fought between the living and the dead against enemies that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. And somewhere in a Portland apartment, 7-year-old Emma Thorne woke from a dream about her father flying with angels, carrying a message she wouldn't understand until she was old enough to wear wings of her own. The Ghost Squadron flew with the precision of pilots who had transcended the limitations of physics and training, their spectral aircraft responding to will rather than control surfaces. Marcus found himself flying in formation with men who had died before he was born, their voices crackling through his radio with encouragement and tactical updates from beyond the grave. "Ghost 77 Actual, this is Ghost 32. We count 40+ bogies converging on your position. Recommend you push for the facility while we buy you time." Lieutenant Daniel Mongoose Rodriguez had been 24 when his Phantom was shot down over the Afghan mountains, his last transmission a warning about entities that could inhabit technology and turn it against its operators. Now his spirit flew, an aircraft made of memory and determination, leading a flight of dead pilots against enemies that existed between dimensions. Cassandra felt her rational mind fracturing as she tried to process what she was witnessing. Her F-22 sensors painted the ghost aircraft as electromagnetic anomalies, barely, their whispers of radar reflection and infrared signature. but her eyes saw them clearly. 13 F-4 Phantoms flying with crystalline precision, their formation holding steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Her father's voice came through the radio with startling clarity, 23 years of death falling away like morning mist. Reaper, this is Ghost 77 laid. Follow my wing. We're going to punch through their perimeter and get you to the facility. Viktor Volkov's Phantom rolled inverted and dove toward the mountain complex, Marcus following in the borrowed aircraft that somehow carried the living pilot's consciousness alongside the dead squadron commander's spirit. Together, they plunged through a gauntlet of alien aircraft that fired weapons designed to destroy matter at the molecular level. The Ghost Squadron spread out to engage the entities, their spectral weapons somehow effective against targets that existed partially outside normal space-time. Marcus watched Phantom missiles track impossible aircraft, watched 20 cannon shells carved from condensed memory tear through hulls that shifted between solid matter and electromagnetic field. It was the battle of Britain fought by dead pilots against living nightmares, a dogfight that spanned dimensions and challenged every law of physics that humanity thought it understood. Facility control. This is Ghost 77 Actual requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. We're coming in hot with approximately 30 bogies in pursuit. The radio crackled with a response from a control tower that had been abandoned for 2 decades. Ghost 77 Actual, this is Angel Base Control. Runway is clear, but be advised that containment has failed at multiple levels. The facility is running on backup power and the kill switch requires manual activation from Level 7. Level 7. Marcus felt Victor's memories recoil from the designation. The facility had been built with 7 underground levels, each one containing progressively more dangerous and incomprehensible artifacts. Level 7 was where they kept the things that could end civilization if they ever escaped containment. It was also 700 feet underground, accessible only by a single elevator that would be a death trap if the entities followed them down. Cassandra brought her F-22 around in a covering pass as Marcus lined up for an approach to a runway that existed in a mountain valley hidden from satellite surveillance and human curiosity. The Phantom touched down hard, its landing gear protesting the rough treatment but holding together through sheer determination. Behind them, the Ghost Squadron was paying the price for their escort mission. Marcus watched through the canopy as spectral phantoms were destroyed one by one, their pilots dying a second time to protect the living pilots who might be humanity's last hope. Ghost 32 exploded in a burst of ethereal fire as Lieutenant Rodriguez's aircraft was caught between 2 biomechanical fighters, his final transmission a Latin prayer his grandmother had taught him as a child in El Paso. Ghost 55 disappeared into a dimensional rift that opened beneath Captain Sarah, Ice Queen Chen's Phantom, her scream echoing across frequencies that existed only in nightmare. One by one, the dead pilots sacrificed themselves again, buying time and distance for the living to complete a mission that should have ended 23 years ago. Cassandra landed her F-22 on a runway that wasn't quite long enough for an aircraft of its size, using every inch of concrete and all of her considerable skill to bring the fighter to a stop before it plowed into the mountain face. She popped her canopy and rolled out of the cockpit, her boots hitting tarmac that was cracked and overgrown with mountain grass. Marcus was already running toward a bunker entrance that looked like it had been built during the Cold War and never updated. The heavy steel door was marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols, but underneath the official notices someone had spray-painted a single word in red letters: Pandora. The elevator shaft is the only way down, he called to Cassandra as she joined him at the entrance. But once we're in there, we're committed. If those things follow us underground, we'll be trapped. Cassandra looked back at the sky where her father's spirit was fighting a running battle against entities that had waited 70 years for their freedom. Ghost 77 lead was holding his own against three attackers, his phantom dancing through energy beams with the skill that had made him a legend among pilots who would never be allowed to acknowledge his existence. But there were too many enemies and too few ghosts. Even the dead couldn't hold the line indefinitely against opponents who existed outside the normal constraints of mortality and physics. "Then we better hurry," she replied, following Marcus through the entrance into a facility that had been built to contain humanity's darkest discoveries. The elevator was an ancient freight unit that descended through solid rock, its cables groaning under loads they'd never been designed to carry. Marcus felt claustrophobia warring with Victor's memories as they dropped past level after level of storage areas, each one containing artifacts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human science. Level 1. Crashed aircraft of unknown origin, their hulls inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Level 2. Biological specimens that might have been alien or might have been the result of experiments that violated every ethical principle humanity claimed to observe. Level 3. Weapons that fired coherent energy and left no residue except ionized air and the smell of ozone. By level 5, Marcus could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on them, thousands of tons of rock held back by engineering and prayer. But it was the psychic weight that was harder to bear, the accumulated presence of things that shouldn't exist, entities that regarded humanity as an infestation to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. Level 7 opened onto a corridor that stretched beyond the reach of the emergency lighting, its walls lined with containment cells that had held their charges for decades. Most of the cells were still sealed, their electromagnetic locks somehow maintaining power despite the facility's compromised systems. But 3 cells stood open, their contents vanished into the upper levels and beyond. 3 entities that had been powerful enough to influence the facility's systems from inside their prisons, patient enough to wait for the right moment to make their escape, intelligent enough to coordinate their efforts with precision that spoke of hive mind consciousness. "The kill switch is in the main control room," Marcus said, Victor's memories guiding them through corridors that had been built like a maze to confuse intruders. "It's a physical switch that has to be thrown manually. Once it's activated, it sends a signal to every containment cell in the facility, forcing anything inside them back to their home dimension and sealing the portals permanently." They found the control room in darkness, its banks of monitoring equipment dead except for a few emergency indicators that cast red shadows on walls covered with technical manuals and safety protocols. In the center of the room, surrounded by fail-safe systems and protected by redundant security measures, was a single lever marked with warnings in 17 languages. Cassandra reached for the switch and felt electricity arc between her fingers and the metal handle.